Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Thriving Adoptees podcast. So today I'm delighted to be joined by Fred Nicora, all the way from South Wisconsin. Welcome to the show, Fred. Looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you, Simon. I'm excited to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity of you having me on your show. I've seen a few of yours and really enjoy them. I think you've really hit the nail on the head in a number of them, so I appreciate it.
Brilliant. So, listeners, Fred is actually even more fluent with his metaphors than me. So we're going to have a metaphor fest, right? But I want to start by reading something from your the blurb for your book, right? So the book, ladies and gentlemen, that's Fred's written, is called Forbidden Roots, and Forbidden Roots. It brings readers into Fred's innermost thoughts as he sees his foundations swept away with a simple slip of the tongue at the age of 41 whilst attending a large family gathering. This gripping and true story about being suddenly thrust into the world of adoption explores the expected and the unexpected as he seeks to understand his new identity and reframe the past. So, wow. This foundation's swept away from you. What was the foundation that was swept away from you, Fred?
Well, as I said, or as you read in that blurb, it's really, and we discussed this a little bit already, the identity that gets swept away. So when we talk about the foundation that's being swept away, if you really start thinking about what you base your entire identity on, it really begins very early on with the nature of trust you have involved in those around you that are caring for you, that provide what you assume to be the facts of the world as opposed to opinions of the world. So at some point when you suddenly find out that those initial assumptions that you made, and I'm going to say as you were an infant just trying to put a grasp on who you are, and as that continued to progress through adolescence until you really establish an identity, it really stems out of family. It stems out of those that were caring from you. It stems out of the pieces that you've put together from them. So that was the foundation that was swept away. That the really understanding of not only who I was, but what the world around me was as well. Because it wasn't just something that happened internally. It happened all around me and the entire world around me. And it affected not only myself, my family, those that knew the secret ahead of time, which was I was adopted. I didn't know that until I discovered at that large family gathering. And just a little background on that gathering, both my parents had passed away already, the parents that raised me, and they gave me a very good upbringing. I appreciate them for who they are. They were loving people. They both came, I'm going to say, as I started to understand myself more and some of the dysfunction that I came about through and have been working to overcome, I can look and see within their families that brought them together too. There was a considerable amount of dysfunction there as well. So for instance, where I'm going, my father, who in the 1930s, his family went through a divorce, was put in an orphanage for a couple of months. And so according to his sister later on, when I talked to her about why my parents chose to not disclose to me the nature of who I was, she explained that my father was a driver of that. He had spent time in an orphanage until she was able to get him out after a couple of years. And it so impregnated his thoughts with the horrors of being an orphan, he wanted to spare those from me. And all I can do is assume that's true. You know, as a late discovery adoptee, I struggle with trust. That's an understatement. I struggle with trust. So, you know, I look at anything and say, well, is that really what they're thinking? You know, and my best guess is it's probably pretty close. They were decent people. My mother came from what I'd call a classic Cinderella story. Her father remarried, and then they had subsequently 4 additional boys, and so she was a classic stepdaughter. And the two of them together, you know, couldn't bear any children, so hence their desire to expand their family, bring me into it. and formulate the decision that they weren't going to tell me. So they had passed away. There was a family gathering of twin uncles in 2000. About 250 people were there. It's at a large restaurant and a banquet hall. And elderly aunt made a slip of the tongue to my now ex-wife that she's known me since the day I was adopted. So that that fractured me.
Yeah,
is the best way to say it. It just fractured me.
What was your response in that moment?
You know, it's interesting because as I describe it in the book, it felt like somebody took two blades of an egg beater, stuck one in each ear, and then just turned the egg beater on high. The future, present, and past all blend together. I literally, and I kid you not, literally lost the sensation of a floor under my feet. For about 2 months, I walked around, I could see the floor down there, but I couldn't feel that my feet were on anything solid. It was the bizarrest experience I ever had. I would say my initial feeling, be it appropriate or not, was tremendous embarrassment. I was ashamed that others knew more about me, about the innermost secret of my life, than I consciously was aware of. As time went on, that melded. Anger settled in. Betrayal was a strong feeling that I had initially. And it's what I found most interesting. And Simon, you're in the United Kingdom. I'm not as familiar, even though I found most of my roots tie back there. I'm like 56% English. A lot of it comes out of the London area, but then I've got Scottish and Norwegian thrown in there too. So I kind of got the Viking package is what I got, you know. And at the time, keep in mind, at the time I discovered, my understanding was I was like everybody else. And if I simply went into the courthouse and asked for my original birth records, they would just hand them over because they were mine. So that Monday after the gathering, the state had to educate me. I'm in Wisconsin. It's a closed record state. So legally, those records are sealed for me. And I didn't comprehend what they were talking about at first. I was confused, you know, and as it started to settle in, I'd say the second blast hit. And that second blast was not only that sense of betrayal from those people in my extended family, but now suddenly it extended to society at large in the state of Wisconsin, that I was now reclassified as somebody else, that I no longer had the privileges that I enjoyed before, that I lost some of those. And that was the second, I'll say, identity hit, trying to come to terms with that. So it was kind of a 1-2 punch within a week that it kind of all assimilated into me trying to figure out who I was, because I lost the old part of who I was. That was gone. That went away the minute that elderly aunt disclosed to me that I was adopted. You know, I was in denial for a while, but it did go away, and I had to replace that. I had a wife. I had 3 kids that were young at the time. I was in the middle of, you know, trying to. I was teaching at the time, so I taught high school and middle school for about 20 years, and fortunately, because of that, it did allow me some flexibility in my schedule. The schedule of teaching is like granite. You can't take days off you don't want to, you know, you'd like, but there are days off that you enjoy, you know, just as a teacher. And so when I found out, it's not like you put the rest of life on hold to say, hold on, excuse me, just a second. I have to rebuild my identity that I just lost, that I thought I had down as I came out of adolescence. But now I found I have to do it again, you know. I still had to work. I still had to provide for my family. I still had to function in a marriage. I still had to, you know, run around society. It was a pretty crazy time. It took a while to really kind of get back onto kilter, I would say.
Yeah. So the master of metaphor there with his egg whisk. The other one that I was thinking of was the Roadrunner cartoon. Yeah, the Roadrunner. Oh. Yeah, when he runs, it runs off the edge of the cliff, beep, beep,
Yes.
runs off the end of the cliff. He keeps running, and then he
Yep.
just goes straight down
Yep.
because he's actually.
Yep.
Wow. And how long ago was this? How long ago was this?
Well, that was in the year
Same
2000. That was in the year 2000. And what the book does is it takes you from that point in time at the year 2000 when I discovered it. It jumps into it right away. It doesn't, there's not a lot of back, I do a lot of backfilling as I'm telling the story, as it's unfolding, as it's appropriate in the book. So you do get that's chapter one. I think the first section is the discovery. And then it does start going into the concept of how to rebuild that foundation. Now, what I would say, and I've keep in mind this was 2000, and I'm going to give you a little additional background here to give you a time frame to understand the context of not only the book but where we are today. So I found out in 2000. It took me till about 2006 until I really was able to, I'm going to say, bring some sense of closure to understanding it. Not close my understanding adoption, because that's an ongoing process that I still am in that today. I have not come to an end of any great journey. I'm mid journey, and I think I'm going to be mid journey until the day I die, and I'm fine with that. I'm comfortable with that. But what I would say is that I managed to lose the obsessive compulsiveness of it occupying every minute of the day in my head. And that happened after about 6 years. There's a culminating event in there. And I don't want to wreck it, but I'll just say it's kind of wild. And, when I look back on it, I mean, I can't believe I went through some of this stuff and I did some of this stuff. But the mind is a crazy thing, as it's trying to scramble and restructure so as to maintain some kind of an ego as it's moving through life. It has a way of reformulating what you're seeing and what you're doing. Now, after that, after about 6 or 7 years, roughly 7 to 8, I came to terms with that. Actually, I had what went from a minor drinking problem to being a full-blown alcoholic, that I had lost control over drinking, and along with some other substance abuse. At that time, because initially I did get very involved in the adoption and adoptee communities, what I found, especially back then, and I'm going to say to an extent, a lot of it's still there today, there is not a shortage of, I'm going to say appropriate, but incinerated anger that just is pervasive throughout the community. There's a lot of people who are trying to work around that, try to move beyond it. And I'd say there is a progression that, at least for me, as I was able to move beyond it, as I was able to come to terms with sobriety, because I'm sober a little over 13 years now. So, after working a program, but while I was working the program, I did unplug from the adoption community. I found I just couldn't do both things at once. Initially I tried, but I would stumble and fall back. And I realized in order for me to move forward as a person, sobriety had to come first. And then once sobriety was in place, then I could start putting some of the other pieces together. And I'd say for me, that's been a path that worked. And my anecdotal, this is not based off any great research or anything. I would say anybody that's kind of in that process of trying to come to terms with adoption, and it's interesting because I'll say, as a late discovery adoptee, and as I've talked to other late discovery adoptees, we do tend to have a similar characteristic. That is, when we find out, we have no hesitation about trying to find a new foundation. Most of us attack that with a very strong sense of urgency, where I've known since earliest recollection adoptees, which are, I assume, the vast majority, I've seen them come out of, and it's labeled the fog, at a slow burning pace, trying to kind of, some of them pop out of it, some of them kind of work their way out, maybe eat their way out of their cocoon, and it's a process in itself that's occurring. That's at least what I've observed. For myself, it was urgent, and the other late discovery adoptees, I found it was urgent. But what I would say is, regardless of where you are, if this is my experience, if you're looking at that path ahead of you, make sure you're sober. Now, if you don't have a drinking problem at all, that is, you have one glass of wine once a week, I don't really care. I don't think that's an issue. If you're an alcoholic, you know it, and you need to deal with that first. That's my view.
Okay. So I'd like to take you back to look at just a couple of things there. I think it's kind of related to what you just finished off with. Is that the anger, the anger wasn't the first thing, right? So the first thing was disorientation, like you've had, and like, so I had my little bit of disorientation at the age of 40, finding out this teddy bear was from my mum, right? My birth mum. And that the first reaction was curiosity, and the reaction a couple of months later was anger. Okay. So that was just about finding the teddy bear, right? Who bought me the teddy bear? But it was kind of disorientating, yeah. Whereas yours is like my sense of disorientation is, yeah, I guess a stumble, and yours is, as you say, the rug being pulled from under your feet, or your whole world, the whole world underneath you, your whole scaffolding falling down. It's like, you know, that the house that was built on sand rather than rock, or whatever, you know, if we carry with the metaphor thing. So there is that change bit. With the betrayal stuff. Can you just hold on a minute? I'm gonna have to. Oh no, sorry, listeners. Back in a moment. It's so funny, isn't it? We're discussing the most fundamental, essential part of who we are, right? That we go into such deep stuff, and then the dog goes mental at the barking at somebody at the door, and it's like, you know, however essential we get, you know, we still have to deal with the logistics. So yeah, it's interesting. And then you went to anger and then betrayal. I think.
Yeah, and what I would say is, what's interesting, I know you said disorientation, and I would say true, disorientation was I would say, you know, and I didn't really understand this fully until fairly recently. My very first reaction really was embarrassment, you know, and I'm going to say it was very inappropriate. You know, a feeling's a feeling. So is it inappropriate? Is it not? No, psychologically, it's what I needed to do at the moment. But what I would say is, I came to terms with understanding that all these people here, these 300 people, knew more about me than I knew about myself. It dove into the basic structure of how we interact with others around us, which is, I have to have some sense of ownership of self, in that I have to have a firm knowledge of who I am and feel comfortable in who I am. Because if there is any disagreement, if I'm not comfortable with who I am, I really can't stand any ground. And so that was part of what I lost too at that moment, was that feeling of self-efficacy, that feeling of the ability to stand as an individual was lost at that moment too. I had to rebuild that. That was, so I would say that embarrassment was there. That embarrassment, I'd say, fairly quickly led to anger. It was within a day or two that everything kind of switched over, and I went from, because I felt like the emperor's new clothes. I don't know if you've heard that fairy tale, but you know, the emperor's running around town on a horse, thinking he's got this beautiful gown on, and he's buck naked. And that's how I felt. I felt totally exposed, totally vulnerable. And I suddenly realized I wasn't wearing any clothes and everybody else was.
Yeah. Well, you are going to feel embarrassed, right?
Yeah.
You know, if you discover you're naked, you're going to feel embarrassed. So, you know, it is probably, as you say, appropriate, you know, like if you put the two metaphors together.
Yes. Yeah, I would say so.
Yeah. I wanted to, on the anger bit and the betrayal thing, I wanted to, something that I see for myself, and my experience of anger towards my birth mother and fear of her amounts to about 40 seconds of my life.
Wow.
40 seconds of my life. That's it. But those two bits, two spells of 20 seconds, right? So God only knows what it's like. And they've been really they were really painful, two really very painful bursts of anger. One was anger of her. One was fear of a second rejection.
Yeah.
Fear. But 20
Well,
seconds. So you're talking about 6 years of getting, like, I can't believe I can't start to imagine how that must have felt.
Well, I did try to go immediately into reunion, once I discovered, and there was no hesitation that I was going to find something to replace what I had lost. And that's what I would say, that's where I've seen a difference between, I'll say late discovery adoptees and those adoptees that knew from earliest memory. In the long run, my overall conclusion, for the most part, pretty much two peas in a pod. I think there's many more similarities than there are differences. With any adoption story, it's unique. We've all got our own tales. They've all got their own twists and turns and unique entities about them. But there's a core of what binds us together. Now it gets interesting, and I've listened to you talk about it on your show several times, with the primal wound theory and the primal wound that occurs. And I've even heard you, say that, different people will experience it to different degrees. Some it might be a minor paper cut. Others it could be a full truncation of their head from their body. What got interesting for me was when I discovered that I was adopted. The initial blast of that day and the subsequent time after that was so blinding. I couldn't see beyond it. I couldn't see beyond anything else besides that betrayal, that hurt. The shame kicked in later. The full-blown coming to terms with exactly, I'm going to say, what a bastard is. And that's another interesting thing that I'm going to say for me on the late discovery side of it adds a little twist, because my psyche was based on the notion that I was not adopted. And even though I would have sworn to you on a stack of Bibles, and I'm a religious guy, I would have sworn to you that on a stack of Bibles, I didn't hold prejudice against adoptees. Yet at the same time, I'm going to say, when I found I was an adoptee, I had a shitload of things to work through. And that had to do with preconceived notions of what I had put together in life over the course of time. And as an example, I remember a discussion I was having with my mother while I was in first grade. And I didn't remember this until after I became aware that I was adopted. So my mind blocked it out. My mind completely blocked out the memory of this discussion. But I came home from school one day and I mentioned to my mother that there was a boy at school who was adopted, and he was always acting out, and he was always angry, and he was always hitting people and very, very argumentative. He was definitely the rebellious adoptee type. And I had met some others along the way, and those pieces of information that I put together did form an understanding of what I perceived adoptees to be like. And you can say I wasn't prejudiced, but at the same time, I'm going to say I had a lot of that stuff to work through and understand that I guess I did hold some prejudicial thought that when I met somebody and they would disclose they were adopted, that it would conjure up, preconceived notions. That's how we all survive. We build off our experiences, and it was just interesting to come to terms with that. It was an eye-opening experience in understanding how sheltered we all are from our own internal prejudicial thoughts as we view the world.
Yeah. The anger and the betrayal, for me, are kind of you're balancing two things. It's like have you heard me talking about the about Wayne Dyer going to his dad's grave to pee on it. Have you heard me tell you about that?
No, I haven't.
Have you heard of this guy, Wayne Dyer? Have you heard of him?
The name's familiar, but I don't know of a grave pee story. So
okay, so he was a positive thinking, one of the founders of self improvement in the 60s.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. Yeah, I've heard of him. I think I've read one of his books.
Yeah. So he started off very psychological, and then he moved. He moved to a more spiritual kind of zone. So the story. Forgive me, listeners, if you've heard this before, but it's the best way I've got of looking at this anger thing from a new perspective. So his father left his mum and Wayne and the rest of the kids to fend for themselves. And he was Wayne Dyer was very angry about it. By a strange series of circumstances, he arrived at his father's grave, and he was going to pee on the grave. And he ranted at his father's, at the graveside for 2 hours. He just had like a complete, like a shouting match at his father. And then he had a spontaneous forgiveness.
Wow.
And he reckons that his life moved forward from that point. So he was unshackled by this anger. This anger was pulling him back. So the metaphor I normally talk about this is like where you're in the basket of a hot air balloon. You're trying to push, trying to let the helium vent to lift you up, but somebody's put a load of sandbags in the basket, and they've also tethered you to the ground with a rope.
Wow.
So you cut the rope, which is the metaphor for a spontaneous forgiveness experience, and you saw, because that's what helium does for balloons, right? Mm-hmm. And what I see is how my anger of the world and my anger towards my birth mother, which only lasted this 20 seconds, right? I saw how that held me back. So there's been a series. It's not once and done. As you said, you talked about the learning journey being forever. I think would be a one way of so it like the hot air balloon. You cut the ropes and then it's gone in a wanna. It's a once and done thing. Whereas these epiphany moments, these changes in our thoughts, these insights, these aha moments, whatever you call them, are ongoing, right? And the reason I tell it, I make it about me, because if I said to the listeners, right, so if you're thinking, do you realize, listener, how much your anger is holding you back? Then they would shut me down, they would blow me out, and that would be. So I make it about me, right? But you're saying that the anger is pervasive in the adoptee community. You're saying that to become sober, you couldn't become sober and have both feet in the adoptee camp. So you had to move out of the anger camp to get sober. And like, for me, I'm getting goosebumps, right? I'm getting goosebumps about that, how big that is. Because, if we are, if we're living in that environment of anger, then how are we gonna have those epiphany moments? How are we gonna have that? How are we gonna have that insight moment? I read this book. I name check it a bit, about a guy who was a heroin addict, and he was he was an adrenaline junkie that became a heroin junkie. Right?
Sure.
And he went on heroin for 2 weeks to see what it was like coming off it. 5 years later, he came off it.
Yeah.
And the book's 8 hours long, right? But the epiphany it lasts. It takes up one sentence of the book, one sentence in 8 hours, and the sentence is, he realizes that who he is bigger than his addiction. He is one sentence, and he doesn't share anything else about it. He just says it's one. I'm looking in my I can't find it. I'm looking in my Audible history to find the book. I will put it in the list. I will put it in the show notes, guys. So in one sentence, he realizes something happens. He has an insight, and he realizes that who he is bigger than his addiction. Now, if that guy would been living in that, surrounded by anger, then the chances of him having that insight are, I would say, kind of reduced. So what do you make of all that?
Well, as you were talking, it's pretty interesting because of the nature of how my journey unfolded. And what I mean by that is I was late discovery adoptee. I had an explosive bout of reunion. I met my birth mother. I found out who my birth father was. He had passed away before I even discovered I was adopted. Met a lot of relatives on his side, put together a lot of pieces, put together a family tree, understood the families, where they came from. Incredible, interesting families. Some of them go back to the mid 1600s in this country, before moving from England, before moving, in the 1700s from Norway. It just following the journeys of these families has been incredible, and all that was very healing. Now, as that applies to what you were saying, when I first discovered I was adopted and submerged myself into the adoptee community. There was the organization Bastard Nation back then. I don't even know if they're still around, but it really was a very anger-filled organization, really focused on trying to bring awareness to the laws that need to be changed. That seemed to be the point of their anger, which justifiably so. That needle hasn't moved much in 20 years. I stepped out of that community and then have reemerged again in the last few years. And what's remarkable to see is, whereas there are still many of the types of discussions occurring that were occurring back around 2000, 2003, 2004, there are other discussions that have evolved so completely and have moved so far forward that really has catapulted the amount and quality of dialogue occurring within the adoptee community phenomenally. When I look at the volume of voices out there, I'm on your podcast today. I've been on a lot of podcasts as of late. There's a lot of people talking. There's a lot of voices getting out there and talking about, these experiences that we all share that we really didn't need to share. If things could have been a little different, and I think we're all trying to make our positive impact on the world. At the same time, I'm going to say the hard part to see is, what you were describing before, I describe as being stuck in the muck. That there's a lot of people within the community today that continue to be stuck in the muck, and that's stuck in that anger phase. And sometimes I get a little concerned that, I'll say well-intentioners, those that are supporting some of the boards, making sure there's space for everybody, Facebook boards for everybody to talk and have their expression, sometimes can enable, I'll say, some of that anger to go on longer than it needs to, go on longer than it should. I think the anger is essential because it provides a fuel. for me, I'm trying to use that anger to really redirect it in terms of energy of trying to change law. And there's currently 2 bills up in Wisconsin right now that I'm somewhat involved in trying to help move forward. Because that is to me the backbone. The laws, for the most part, and these are unique to the U.S. I don't know exactly what your laws are in the UK, but most of the states here still are closed law states. Some are kind of hybrid. Wisconsin's more closed than open. The process for me to discover, which is the same today in 2023, it's the same. If I wanted to find out who I was, I first of all would have had to apply, pay money, and wait time to the state of Wisconsin, who would have then searched, found, and redacted my entire adoption file, blurting out any identification information. So basically stripping away what I needed out of the file, then turning it over to me. After reading it, I was eligible to write a letter to my birth mother, who, after describing who I was and why I wanted to find out who I was, I would need to turn that letter over to the state of Wisconsin. The state of Wisconsin would then call my birth mother, who and read the letter to her, explaining to her her rights of either accepting or declining my request to find out who I was. If she declined for whatever reason, I would have had to wait 5 years. I could have written a second letter after 5 years. If she would have declined that letter, it was terminal. I wasn't allowed to pursue again. And that was pretty ludicrous to me. As a person that didn't wear the adoptee clothes of, oh, I'm a shameful creature, so therefore I should have diminished rights. I suddenly found myself now in that chair where, like, oh, just be grateful. Just be grateful that you have a pulse and you're breathing and you got to experience life. Because quite frankly, if you would have been born 10 years later, you would have been a flush. There's that harsh reality here in the US, just looking at how laws played out. So I'd say, going back to that, the anger is essential. The anger helps us propel forward. But at the same time, I think you're right. You have to have those epiphany moments of realizing that the anger is holding you back. It's an anchor. And until you can release some of that, until you can let some of that go, until you can, and I'm going to go down a dangerous path here, find some forgiveness at some level, I think you're going to be stuck in the muck. I think that it's hard.
So the thing about Wayne Dyer is he didn't go looking to find forgiveness. Forgiveness found him. Yeah.
I'll run with that. We could get into a chicken and egg, and then I could try bringing God into the discussion, which often could, I'll say, within the adoptee community, I tend to get flaming spears of anger hurled at me often. So,
yeah. So,
sorry to throw that one at you, Simon.
Yeah.
At the end, and I'll say this in all fairness, because I truly want to be helpful to people. That's my main goal. How do I take this lemon and turn it into lemonade? That's what that's what my life is about today. And what I would say is, for myself, having to go through recovery, coming to terms with realizing that if I didn't find forgiveness at some level, I was probably going to kill myself. It was that simple. If I didn't figure out how to open that door at some level, I was probably going to kill myself. And I'm going to say that even though I put down the bottle, it didn't mean I necessarily embraced trying to preserve my life. I have had a nasty relationship with nicotine since I was 13. I've, used many other substances along the path. Alcohol was the one that finally kind of threw me under the bus. But what I would say is, as of late, and I'm going to say within the last year or so, I finally started to put away all those things that I was using to kill myself. That I was trying to numb the pain, I guess you would say.
Yeah. So, can you share some of your epiphany moments?
Some of my epiphany moments. Sure. and some of them are going to tie into recovery. One of them, and I'm going to go down this path, was the counselor I had for outpatient counseling. As I described my whole plight, and of course, when you start looking at my story and what alcohol is an emotional accelerant. So it would allow me to take those emotions and basically douse them with gasoline and let them thrive. And they were not good emotions at times, and they were self-destructive emotions. And at the end of the day, I had to figure out how to prevent the self-destructive side of what I was trying to do from succeeding, from taking my life. And my counselor made the comment to me all of a sudden at one point. He goes, "You know what? Sounds like you're angry at God." And it was an epiphany that, yeah, I think I was. I was pissed off at God. How did you let this happen? Why could you let this happen? And I was raised in a Lutheran household, a Lutheran church household. So I had exposure to, I'm going to say, the tools of spirituality. And I actually went through a period in my early 20s where I became very involved in a relationship with Jesus Christ, for myself. I drifted away from that over time. And, I found that many of those tools of spirituality were the same tools that I learned how to use in recovery. And when I say tools, trying to use a faith in something versus a numbing and pretending it doesn't exist. Try to remove myself from the center of the universe and create a universe that's bigger than just me, that I'm part of, not the center of. Those were epiphany moments that helped me figure out how to find forgiveness and put away some of the anger. Because if I didn't put away the anger, for me personally, I was not going to stop drinking. I was not going to stop trying to kill myself.
Yeah.
It's my simple truth. I've had to come to terms with it.
So you said creating a universe that's bigger than me. I would sort of put that alongside the epiphany that the heroin addict had, was seeing that he is bigger than his addiction. So
yes, it's recognizing the addiction as an attribute. It's a characteristic. I'm an addict. I'll always be an addict. I'm an addict that's currently practicing recovery. I'm an addict that's currently sober. I'm an addict that works a program to help me stay that way. Eventually I did go back and dive deep into the adoption stuff. Part of the counseling I received going through recovery dealt with adoption, and coming to terms with that, trying to understand the impacts and love myself, as opposed to let others define what I could and could not love about myself. That was another big moment.
So how do you see identity?
How do I see identity? Identity, that I'm going to say that is a big question. And do I have the sole pat answer to it? No. What I would say is what I've discovered about identity, there's different components to identity. I was a teacher for 20 plus years. I taught high school and middle school in Wisconsin and Minnesota. And as a teacher that goes through training, you are educated to heavily weigh on the nurture side of life. If you didn't believe nurture couldn't impact, you wouldn't be a teacher. I'm just going to say, if everybody was just an uncontrollable developing bundle of genetic, cells, there wouldn't be a need for a teacher. So going into teaching, I probably placed 20% of the identity on the nurture side. That is, we learned our identity, and maybe 80% would have been the nurture side, 20% the nature side. As time went on and I taught longer and longer and went through my experience of being a late discovery adoptee, I came to terms with, for myself, I see today it's the complete converse. I believe today that 80% is nature and there's 20% that is actually nurture. And my best analogy for that, we're going to go back into the land of metaphors here, is I cannot turn a Pekingese into a pit bull but I can teach them both to sit. So I can modify their behaviors, but I can't change the basic construct of who they are. So in answer to your question, identity, I think it has a lot to do with our genetic makeup. Most of it actually is that those things that we come predisposed to will drive our personality, will drive our interests, will drive our interactions, who we connect with, how we interface with the world, how we cope with stress. I believe my alcoholic tendencies actually come out of a genetic predisposition toward alcoholism. And it's kind of interesting when you get into the nature of those. There was a Time article, and it's back in 2000. I wish I would have kept it because I can't find it anymore. But it dealt with looking at some of the genetic material, the DNA commonalities, and there's two groups they looked at specifically. One was addicts and alcoholics, and they found that they had a striking resemblance in those genetic ties, those links in our DNA, to those people who also had strong genetic ties to evangelicalism. That is the need for a heightened spiritual awareness of proclaiming that outward. Those genetic packages seem to be somehow linked. And I believe it to be true. So in answer to your question, I think a lot of it is tied up in who we are, the genetics of who we are. And then the learned behavior is something that we put on top of it. And we use it to modify, and in my case, to try to maybe alleviate some of the self-destructive tendencies I may have gone down into.
Yeah. So how do you see me do the diamond metaphor, right?
Yes. Yeah, and
how does that stack?
And I've even brought exception to it a couple of times as I've been talking to you. There is, to me, and what I've come to see is, because I believe that primal wound that occurred is real, and I'm going to say I'm with you on the page that I think it impacts us to different degrees. But what I am going to say is that because of when it occurs, which is at the instant of birth, that it therefore creates a filter that's put into all further development. So can I get back to that whole soul core of, who I would have been had I not been adopted? I don't believe so. That adoption is an experience that I have had, and it permanently affected the way I developed from that moment on, which was birth. And it therefore affected, I'm not going to go good or bad, but I will say it affected how I perceived the world from then out. So can I get back to that diamond? I don't know if I can get back to that diamond. Can I manage it so that I maximize what I'm able to pull out of the diamond? Yes, I would say that I can do.
So I would say that my epiphany is actually all about the fact that we are the diamond, whatever the filters. I totally agree with the filter idea. I think that's a brilliant way of seeing it or explaining it. So everything. If we've got orange goggles on, then even white snow looks orange.
Yep, that's how we see it, and we can't change it.
That's how we see it until we take the goggles off with the epiphany, right?
And that's the question: can we actually take the goggles off? I guess. What I would say is I can learn to understand, even though my eyes are reading it as orange, that it's really white. But I think my eyes are going to continue to read it as orange. Yeah, that would be my interpretation, and maybe we're a little different there. But I like yours.
It's experience, right? So
yes,
it's an epiphany. It's an epiphany experience, and we could get really. I'm trying to point at this through a metaphor, right? And all metaphors are approximations.
Yes, very true. Generalizations.
all general, all words. What if so? The guy I quote all the time, this Rupert Spira guy, he says, if we wanted to talk about the truth, then we remain silent.
Interesting.
But words are all we've got, right?
Yes. Yeah, very, very interesting.
Very interesting.
And hence starts the rationalization of life.
Indeed. That's for another conversation later in the year, my friend.
Very true.
Thank you. So check out Fred's book in the show notes, listeners, and his website. And this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you very much for sharing your stuff, Fred, and thank you for listeners.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Simon. Yeah, and I will say www.frednicora.com. That's where you find out about me, my book, and love to hear from you. Love to hear what you think.
Yeah, brilliant. So links in the show notes, guys, to Fred's website. I know some of you'll be driving, walking the dog, or whatever you're doing. Ironing. I listen to podcasts while I'm ironing. I don't have a pen.
I walk my dog all the time to podcasts. It's awesome.
Thanks, listeners. Goodbye.